So I think the first thing to start with here really is what motivated this book at this time? Why now? Why, after all of these years, come out with a book warning everyone about nuclear war, besides the obvious case of our commander-in-chief in office right now?
Better late than never. What can I say? I really intended as, I don't suppose anyone here has actually read any of the book, have they? Can I see hands if anyone has? Okay, just 2 or 3. But it starts off in the introduction by revealing something that was very much of a secret during my trial, and really ever since until then, which is that when I copied the Pentagon Papers in 1969, which were a 47-volume top secret study called History of U.S. Decision-Making in Vietnam from 1945 to 1968. Can you hear me in back, all right? Oh, no. Wait, okay. Can you hear me now? In back, yes? Okay, better? Good. When they said to hold this very close to my throat, to my mouth, I had to think I should really have a Kleenex over it because I've had a cold here. Really?
Right here, yeah.
Okay, is this okay?
Okay.
Yeah, okay, good.
Great.
Yeah, I don't want to hand this one to anybody else after I've been using it. Sorry. I copied the 7,000 pages, top secret, and gave them to the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and ultimately to 17 newspapers after 4 injunctions were brought against them. The Times, the Washington Post, and then 2 other injunctions to the St. Louis Post-Dispatch and the Boston Globe, and then they stopped trying to enjoin it. But actually, that was in 71. The copying was in 69, and at the same time that I was copying those pages, I was copying everything else in my top secret safe in my office in RAND, things that I, in many cases, was the only one authorized to be seeing them. In fact, that included the Pentagon Papers themselves. But most of what I copied really had to do with my years of work on command and control of nuclear weapons and devising nuclear war plans as a consultant from the RAND Corporation, and then part of the time as an employee of the Defense Department in '64. And my intention was to put that all out after the Pentagon Papers had had their trial, or their trials. Several were scheduled on that, actually. I was put on trial for copying the Pentagon Papers. There was another grand jury going on in Boston at the same time for the distribution of the Pentagon Papers, which I would have been involved in, which, by the way, did focus on indicting Neil Sheehan and Hedrick Smith and other journalists. When people say now that no journalist has yet been indicted, that's true, but it's not true that they've never thought of indicting a journalist before. Nixon did have that in mind until the peculiar way my case got ended and the grand jury was dropped. But I thought that after the Pentagon Papers had had what effect they could have in shortening the Vietnam War as of 69 or 71, that then I would put out the material on the nuclear. And just briefly, why that didn't happen, then I'd given it to my brother for safekeeping. He had put all the material I'd given him, he didn't know what it was, especially, into it was in a cardboard box. He put it in a large green garbage bag and put it in his compost heap. Then he moved it to a trash dump, which was just in time because the neighbors said the FBI were poking that compost heap the next day after he'd moved it with long flexible rods. So he had it under a green stove in the Terrytown trash heap dump to mark its location in a bluff on the side of a road. And while I was on trial in 71, and that continued till 73, Tropical Storm Doria came, a small hurricane, and scattered the trash dump all over the landscape. The stove itself was blown apart by about 100 yards, so they couldn't tell where it had been. The bluff went down the side of the hill, and my brother and a friend of his spent weekends for a year while I was on trial trying to recover that garbage bag. They even hired a backhoe at one point and found a lot of green garbage bags in the trash dump, but none with top secret documents, you know. I eventually had to give up at about the time when my trial ended in '73, that those documents were unrecoverable. And I tell this story now. One reviewer, Graham Ellison, said, "Why didn't he tell this story 45 years ago?" I could think of no reason I would have told this story 45 years ago. I always felt it made me look like a schlemiel, basically, of having lost these documents. And we didn't have the documents to show, so there was nothing much to be gained by telling that story. And I just tell it in passing now in the book, partly in answer to the question you raised, why now? The fact is that the other part of the answer is I did what I could to transcribe for my lawyers about a 500-page transcript of what I'd worked on in the Pentagon that might come up during the trial. And I used that as a basis for a submission to my publisher at that time, and the editor said this book would sell 1,400 copies. And I said, well, that's one for every member of Congress. That's all right, you know. Some other people working on arms control said, no, that means we wouldn't publish it. And really, several other times, I've run into the same result. And essentially, this time, I just went ahead and decided, well, I'll do it myself if I have to. This book was turned down by 17 publishers on commercial grounds. No one wants to read about nuclear war, period, which I've heard from other people for a long time. In fact, an earlier agent had told me he wouldn't represent me on a book about nuclear weapons, nuclear war. So we'll see. It is true that I am rewarded now by the presence of Donald Trump in the White House, which has focused people on that problem for the first time in many years. So there's a silver lining to anything, even the end of the world here, in terms of sales. I hope you will read the book. That's the point of it. And all of it, including something that no one has yet commented on, actually, even in the reviews. I've gotten good reviews, but they hardly any have commented on the fact that I really spent a fair amount of time in the last part of the book telling about strategic bombing in World War II, because I've always thought it's not possible to imagine, to believe, to credit the nature of our strategic war planning now, nuclear war planning, without knowing its roots in the firebombing of World War II, about which most Americans know almost nothing. Anymore, this is a prejudicial analogy, but you'll see, it'll probably come up in the evening. Any more than Japanese know a lot about the rape of Nanjing. They really don't learn it much in their high schools. And very few Americans, in fact, I'll even ask right now, how many people here feel that you know when and what was the greatest act of terrorism in human history? And by terrorism, I mean the deliberate killing, massacring of civilians, non-combatants, or not threatening anybody, for a political purpose, killing civilians for a political purpose. What was the largest single night of terrorism in human history? Let me see, don't be modest, let me see how many hands. Well, that's almost more than I might have expected. Let me just take one. What was that? What would you say? What? Couldn't hear it. Could you hear it? No, Hiroshima. No. That's a good guess. Okay, but it's not the case. Hiroshima and Nagasaki are not, yes? Right. The night of March 9th and 10th, 1945, 5 months before Hiroshima, 1945, General Curtis LeMay, head of our strategic bombing in the Pacific, used the results of months and years of experimentation with killing civilians by fire, with burning people to death. As it happened, most people will remember Dresden. How many people here have heard of the Dresden massacre? I was in Dresden a couple of years ago. Well, a third here, so forth. Okay. But Dresden was by far not the largest case of actual burning, of fire. Perhaps 38,000 people died in Dresden. Actually, at the time, some people put another zero on that. You know, they thought there was more than 100,000, but actually it was 38,000 according to the best records in the city then. On March 9th and 10th, just after Dresden, which was mainly British Operation Dresden, along with US participation on the second day, General Curtis LeMay sent his firebombers in at low altitude, loaded with incendiary bombs and burned to death between 80 and 120,000 people in one night. And they did not die well. I won't, it may even be worth going into a little bit what that means. But there's no question about it. What we did was we brought the ovens to the civilians in their beds or in their shelters, in their homes, and killed about 100,000 people one night. I think had that not been done and then imitated in each of the next 64 cities in population of Japan, where they never got a firebombing for, killing about 900,000 civilians before Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Japan. So they say, okay, now that I've said it, have I jogged your memory? How many people now remember having heard of that bombing? Can I see hands? Okay, perhaps 20? So roughly,
yeah.
Roughly 20.
30, 40.
That's part of 30, part of our history that the Japanese know pretty well, but we don't. And the fact is that having done that, there really was no decision to be made about Hiroshima in a moral nature or strategic nature. People searched for what was the reason, what was the overpowering, overwhelming reason that led people to drop this bomb once it had been developed. And the answer was there was no decision to be made and none was raised. No issue was raised. We did with one bomb what we'd been trying to do, sometimes successfully, every night for 5 months. We'd spent that time killing as many civilians, Japanese, as we could, night by night, except they never again got a big firestorm going, which is another story we have to get back to. But that's, as I say, I felt that was quite an important part of the book, and the last part I wrote, and I hope that people read that part and don't just skip over it as history.
So that leads to a couple of, I think, really interesting questions. The first question is, what do you think it was in LeMay, who was obviously General Curtis LeMay, who was a very famous Air Force general who was known for his, to be a character, to say the least. What do you think it was, the moral switch that allowed the United States to participate in these sorts of firebombings, or trying to engender these sorts of firebombings? And then emerging from that, as World War II is often, of course, seen in the American imagination and memory as the good war. And so I'm wondering if you think that it's impossible for there to be moral strategic bombing. Is it impossible for there to be a moral strategic bombing?
Well, look, people ask right now whether it's possible to have a nuclear war that doesn't violate humanitarian law, international humanitarian law. And that's easy to answer in a way. War, not so easy. But a use of nuclear weapons, the US always brings up, or the British brings up, anti-submarine war, where the explosion is under the surface, space war, perhaps air war, high altitude over the Arctic or something where not many, or the desert. Now the desert is not quite so hypothetical. To have used nuclear weapons, for example, against the trench lines of the Iraqis in 1991 would really have threatened very few civilians. It would have been aimed at aggressors in Kuwait, would have killed them, probably been fairly effective in doing that. I'm tempted to give a detail here, and in a way, I'm diffident about doing it to anybody, so not over the dinner table. Here we are in a church. But let me mention one thing.
2 Jews in a church.
Yeah, no, what?
2 Jews in a church.
Yeah.
two people of Jewish descent in a church.
Okay, yeah, right. Well, just this little detail. I was asked to speak to my my son's school as we approached the Gulf War in 1991. And there had been a lot of publicity that the Iraqis were masters of field fortification, so-called field entrenchment, during the Iran War with Iran, which we had supported. Both sides, actually, encouraged Saddam to attack Iran and then given targeting information to each side against the other, including the materials for poison gas in some cases. So we've sort of been deeply involved in that one, even before we sent our troops over. But in the Iran-Iraq War. I'd been a Marine platoon leader, infantry platoon leader, and a rifle company commander in peacetime in Camp Lejeune, North Carolina. And then I'd used that training I'd given as a battalion operations training officer in Vietnam, where I was a civilian. And I walked with troops there, having had this training, knew what I was doing in the field, and saw combat up there fairly close. So I had that experience, low-level experience. When I saw the entrenchments that the Iraqis had, where they're in their positions in Kuwait, which they had invaded in 1921, which involved field after field of barbed wire trenches, deep slit trenches, very hard to kill people in trenches, actually, as they found in World War I. But nuclear weapons would do it. The idea, a Marine was going to be sent up north, the coast, against those fortifications. And as a former infantry officer in peacetime, but also who had been in Vietnam, it made my blood run cold to think of how it would be like World War I. Let's go over the top, men, into the barbed wire and against the machine guns and the artillery coming down, and just suicidal. And I felt very, very dismayed at the thought that we were going to attack those positions head on. And in fact, what actually happened was that they had planned to do that, but instead, Schwarzkopf devised what they call the Hail Mary maneuver. They moved people very far, flanking the other side, and came at them from the other side. So he didn't make a frontal attack on the end. What just came into my head, because it relates to the subject of this evening, I think, a great deal, is this fact. They did have a device for dealing with the troops in the trenches. They bulldozed the trenches with huge bulldozers, and they buried the people alive. We, the Americans, did that. Now, that was a tactic I had not learned in infantry school. Exactly. And as I say, the thought of charging, bayonets fixed and so forth, charging those people was blood-curdling. But something about, there were even pictures of the arms and legs sticking out of these trenches that had been buried alive by bulldozers. Okay, the subject here is, how do people come to do that or plan to do that? And the answer is fairly easily, actually. It's something humans are capable of being heartless, if you like, toward other humans to a degree that we just deny to ourselves. It's a denial. It's not part of our identity that humans act this way in warfare. And not only in warfare, of course, but in warfare in particular. And one way of summing this up, I've said for a long time, when we say, this is inhuman, say, no other species does this. It's very human. Humane is not a synonym for human, and vice versa. Human is not a synonym for humane. And when I say it ties in with what we're dealing with here, is how do people come to make plans for killing, and we haven't really got to this yet, but killing, let's just say, vast numbers of other civilians. And I'm saying historically, Americans have become almost addicted to bombing because we've thought of ourselves as having, or I should say the Air Force thinks of itself, as having won a war, Second World War, with bombing. Not Germany. It took troops on the ground to do it in Germany, but in Japan, they feel they won the war, and especially with firebombing. LeMay, you mentioned, we had great misgivings about using the atom bomb at all, as did his boss, Spaatz, who's his superior in the Pacific, because they could see right away, how do you justify a large Air Force after the war when you can do the job of 300 bombers with one bomber? And that worried them, as a matter of fact. But the idea was, and the Americans didn't quite start that. The first to do it, as I tell in the book quite a bit, chronologically, are probably the Japanese in China. And then Guernica. It's funny, I was doing an interview this morning. I was not supposed to do it, but with an Italian for Repubblica in Italy. And as I found myself talking to them, I mentioned some of this background. I said Guernica, and I put in the little known footnote, Italians participated. Mussolini's Air Force participated in Guernica. It wasn't just the German Condor Legion. I wonder how many of their readers would have picked that one up before. But anyway, the deliberate destruction, of course, is depicted by Picasso in his painting, Guernica, of the, actually remember, what is the scene of a bull rearing, in fear and anger. And I believe there are sort of limbs, severed limbs that you see in the course of this. Well, the Nazis did it. They did it in the London Blitz, straight terror bombing. But people in the RAF had long been waiting for the ability to use their bombers in just that fashion, and they found the German use of it liberating for them. As a matter of fact, the Liberator bomber, that was a US bomber, I think, right? B-24. But they did it immediately then afterwards. They found that for just operational reasons, they couldn't fly during the day. Too many of them got shot down, British bombers. They weren't able to fly high enough and have enough, they didn't have enough armament. They were getting shot down. They had to go at night. At night, you couldn't pick out, you were asking now what kind of target, a base or a port or a factory. In practice, our bombers with the Norden bombsight had actually rehearsed in Arizona and Texas, hitting a particular corner of a factory. That's how precise they thought they were. Well, actually, the British discovered they had to go at night, and going at night, it was hard to find the right town, the right city, but you couldn't take a target meaningfully less than a city, or in particular, the built-up parts of a city. And to get the most effect, you used incendiaries where wherever it landed, the fire could spread to closely packed housing and so forth. Eventually, the US picked up that tactic for much the same operational reasons. Hard to bomb through clouds, through bad weather, the radar wasn't good enough, and so forth. So by the time of Tokyo, then, LeMay took on what his superiors wanted, which was firebombing that would burn to death as many people as possible. And I used to think, I was 14 at that point, that we didn't know they were really doing that. But I was very struck, and it's in the book. I reproduced the headlines from the first page that were rather astonishing. Not only did Time magazine at the time say, I remember this phrase, I have it in the book, last night, General Curtis LeMay's Firebirds demonstrated that properly kindled Japanese cities would burn like autumn leaves. Well, the cities, of course, were cities of people. But even so, I didn't see a number attached to that Japan thing, except that in May, when they went over again, they put an overestimate of how many were killed on this second wave of attacks in Tokyo. And the headline in the New York Times, which I wasn't reading then in Detroit, the headline was 1 million killed. Now that was a subheading, not a big astonishing thing, just 1 million killed. And in fact, they didn't describe it in the text till almost the end of the article. No protest, no questions raised in Congress, no nothing. Now, they didn't kill 1 million on that occasion, anything close to it, but they were able to say that, saying we had become, in a certain sense, we had become depraved, simply, both the bombers and the people who accepted this. And we talked about Bataan death marks as and in answer to your question again, what was Truman's announcement when he first announced the bomb? Last night we bombed a military base, Hiroshima, a military base. Well, there was a military base in Hiroshima, but it was at the edge of the town. It was not damaged, it was not targeted. The target was the center of the town. And it was days, I understand, reading the history, before people really understood there was a city associated with that military base. Actually, the city was the target. I'm saying, if you understand this, you can understand how the Air Force went ahead then, building bombers and making plans for the purpose of incinerating many, many, many people.
But what's really interesting, and I think you bring this up in the book in a really illuminating way, is that one of the reasons that these sorts of horrific...
A little slower for me, my hearing.
Absolutely.
Sorry.
Of course. So one of the really interesting things that you bring up in the book is how these actions, especially during World War II, were justified by arguing either that not the Nazis in this case, but that the Japanese imperial armies were an existential threat to the United States and to Western democracy, and therefore, if we wanted to defeat an enemy, we would have to adopt aspects of terror bombing and basically tactics that were understood to be against democratic tradition. But what's so interesting, and you talk about this in the book, is how this sort of ideology was very neatly assimilated into the logic of the early Cold War. So I was wondering, as someone who lived through it and who decided to work for the Rand Corporation in the 1950s, which was a think tank very much dedicated to fighting the Cold War, why did you, at the time, view the Soviet Union as an existential threat that was analogous to Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan? It makes sense a little bit when you're talking about with Stalin, but Stalin dies in March 53, so how come after March 53 everyone still seems to think that the Soviet Union is Nazi Germany reincarnated to some degree? And this really, I think, is a really critical intellectual underpinning for strategic bombing, for the development of all of these nuclear war plans, and really for the arms race. So I'm curious, one, why did you at that time make that intellectual choice? And then two, what got you out of it? What got you thinking that the Soviets actually aren't bent on killing everyone like the Nazis were?
Well, I presume you realize that when you ask why did Daniel Ellsberg think this, you're aware everybody I knew thought that. I mean, this was in the air.
Henry Wallace.
There were everyone I knew, I say, and that included...
But for example, Henry Wallace, in 1940,
I distributed leaflets for Henry Wallace on 1948, on Election Day, staying away from the polling places. And I was strongly backing Henry Wallace because I was very interested in the labor movement. I majored in labor economics for the first 3 years at Harvard, with the intention of being either a labor organizer, rather romantically, or a labor economist. I joined the UAW when I was 17, and I worked in the Dodge Hamtramck plant when I was 17, with that intention. Next year, different kinds of work. And how I got out of that is another story, but in part because the labor movement was retrenched in the course of the Cold War. It was kind of swallowed up. The Democrats actually, this is a bit of esoteric history, and I'm no expert in it, but they pretty much co-opted the labor movement by getting anti-communist labor leaders like my hero, Walter Reuther of Detroit, against more left-leaning or communist-oriented labor leaders in United Electric and in the faction in the UAW. So, and in effect, moved them away from foreign policy, any emphasis that Wallace was involved in. They pretty much deprived Wallace of most of his backing in 48 by red baiting him and saying that only communists would back him. Well, that was not at all true. In 47, 48, he was extremely popular. But by the time they'd finished demonizing him, others had dropped away, and pretty much communists were his core of support at that point. But I came to believe, by the way, that my own brother, who was very leftist, was ignoring the realities of what was going on in Europe at that very time. And I was very impressed by the Berlin blockade. Looking back on it, it's extraordinary to think, well, I'd been 15 when the war ended, 14, I'm sorry. 14 when the war ended. But during the war, read the Star and wonderful things about the bravery, which was realistic, actually, on the Eastern Front in Russia, and they were our allies, very much so. But it's rather extraordinary to think that 3 years after the war ended, Americans in mass, myself very much included, now 17, were determined to stand with the brave Berliners against this tyranny. You know, and they were now our allies, and we were, Curtis LeMay, actually, this was the best action of his life probably, was in charge of the airlift, which was bringing in even coal in airplanes for the people of Berlin. The switch was to perceive, as you say, Stalin as Hitler. And after 49, Hitler armed with nuclear weapons. But in the Berlin blockade, 48, we had the monopoly of nuclear weapons. Truman sent B-29 bombers, known as the atomic bomber, which had dropped the bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, sent them over to Britain for the first time with a lot of publicity, and LeMay with them, symbolizing, you know, LeMay was the symbol of using nuclear weapons. And we were sending nuclear bombers over there to assure the Russians that if they stopped our air supply, which they could easily do because Berlin was 100 miles inside, or 200, what is it, inside East Germany, their air could have quite easily harassed and interfered with our air operations. They didn't do that for fear that that would start a nuclear war. By who? By us. Now, whether in fact our nuclear threats were critical or not, Truman believed they were, and even General Marshall, who was a very stable, admirable person in most respects, came to believe that the nuclear threat had enabled us to keep hold of Berlin as a free city inside a tyranny in East Europe. So that the nuclear threat had succeeded in that. And as I'm saying, once you believe that the threat has worked, you tend to use it again. But in my case, and everybody's case, it wasn't that hard to imagine that we had another Hitler here, which is what we were hearing. Because it seemed little question, but that the people of East Europe were being held captive, down in effect, against their will. In 1953, there was a significant uprising in East Berlin, actually, which scared the hell out of the Russian leaders and led to very great repression. But it was clear, I think, in looking back, and I put it this way in the book, the reality of that was this: Stalin was as ruthless as Hitler, as a matter of fact. In terms of body counts, he probably killed more people than Hitler and killed more communists than Hitler did. And that's not a irony or a joke, that was what happened. We're hearing about Ukraine now and their relations with Russia. Well, Ukraine in the early 30s had been left to starve by the millions, but actually what amounted to more than 10 million people starved to death. So you couldn't get more ruthless than Stalin.
But then the question
and
is,
Hitler wasn't.
So Stalin dies in 53.
Yes, in 53. But the story was, which was quite wrong,
Wrong.
but the story that here's the other point, I never heard questioned, was that the heirs of Stalin were the heirs of a Bolshevik doctrine that Stalin had simply exemplified, or was the executive manager of a doctrine, a cold-blooded doctrine for world domination and for taking over, and that his heirs were Bolsheviks who were simply as tough, as ruthless, which was not true at all. Why were they holding down all of East Europe, other than to take over Europe as a whole, as a base, unless we stopped them? Well, there was an answer. And to show now how far denial and how broad denial can be and how deep it can be, it isn't that obscure an idea. The Russians had been invaded by Germany twice in the same century. And there was no issue more critical in their minds, and we knew it, than to keep from being invaded another time from Germany. And not to go through the whole history as I now understand it, but in a perspective entirely different from what I held throughout the Cold War, their motives, let's just put this as a hypothesis that was not in my mind at that time, that their grip on East Europe was to assure that Germany, if it was going to be rearmed by the West, which it was, would be divided and would confront a heavy buffer zone before it could do anything to Russia, before they could do anything to Russia again. I have to say, this may sound astonishing, but I just put it to you. the following. I don't think it ever occurred to anybody I knew of to think of the tyranny, and it was a genuine tyranny, of the Russians, the Soviets, in East Europe as being defensive, which they thought of it almost exclusively, rightly or wrongly, as being defensive. That was not in our heads at all. The differences between thinking whether climate right now is man-made in some degree, the climate changes, or not. And if you believe one thing, it's almost hard to put yourself in the skin. But at least here is an issue where that particular division is in the public domain. People know there's a controversy about it, to say the least. There was no controversy about this at the time. Our elites in the Congress, in the academies entirely, and in the unions, which had come to be by 48, 49, 50, purged of left-wing elements and were entirely Cold Warriors. And so everywhere you turned, actually, for advice, you've got this idea, we are holding back an expansionist power. And what I was about to say was, the ruthlessness was not exaggerated. The tyranny was not exaggerated. It was a tyrannous dictatorship, not different in that respect from Nazi Germany. But in terms of a willingness to expand at great risk, at suicidal risk and recklessness, not there at all. And yet that was not even raised as a hypothesis, that there wasn't that difference. So if I may say, my friend Judith here who, by the way, Judith and her husband sitting here, David Barash and Judith Lipton, went over my manuscript so carefully that I really feel I can't be blamed for any remaining errors in this. I say in the book, I've always wanted to say that in a book, but it's true in this case. I mean, I don't see how they can, in good conscience, escape responsibility for any remaining errors. But one thing, though, that you did say was that I had played the devil's game and that I had made a great change about nuclear weapons. Now, I would always have said, and I would still say right now, my attitudes toward nuclear weapons did not actually change very much in the course of my life. As I say in the book, and I won't go repeat it here, but I happened to be in a minority of Americans, and I won't tell the reasons why, who was very dismayed and made very uneasy and anguished by the bomb when I was 14 years old. And I never really changed that attitude, even though later I was working on war plans. Now, how could that be? And the answer is, the same way, and not to give myself airs here, I'm talking about a 14-year-old boy, 20-year-old, to compare myself, let's say, to Leo Szilard, or Rotblat, who later shared the Nobel Peace Prize as representing the International Physicians for Prevention of Nuclear War, Joseph Rotblat. They worked on the Manhattan Project because they were sure that they were in a race with the Germans, who had, after all, actually discovered fission, first achieved it and then explained it, Germans. And there was every reason to think that in a theoretical way, at least, they were ahead of us in exploiting the possibility of a bomb. And so, really, as they, of course, like Szilard in particular, and a number of others, like Eugene Rabinowitz, who was later the publisher of the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, and established the Doomsday Clock under his editorship of the Bulletin of Atomic Sciences. That did not represent a change for him from his working on the bomb during the war, because the purpose during the war was to ensure, if possible, that there would be no nuclear war, that the Germans would not have a monopoly of nuclear weapons, which they thought of as an ultimate terror. And in fact, if Germany, and this is just a real speculation on my part, and you're the historian, I put it to you, if Hitler was not being pressed to military expansion by anyone known to me. I've studied this quite a bit. I don't remember ever reading somebody who was to the right wing of Hitler on this one, more militaristic, certainly not his generals. But he was telling them in 37, the Hosbach Memorandum, and in 39, his plans for expansion. Now that was not because everybody realized if Germany doesn't expand, they're in deep trouble. No, that was Hitler who got it in part from Albrecht Haushofer, the geopolitician. What if Hitler had waited? The fission is in 1938. The Munich is in 38, but his takeover of Prague, the rest of Czechoslovakia, the beginning of 39. No resistance to that because of threats they were making against Prague, straight blackmail. If you don't let us in, Goering was saying to Hacha, the president of Czechoslovakia, our bombers will burn Prague to the ground. Let me assure you, we have laid on very generously on this. Nothing will remain in Prague. And when Hacha finally signed the agreement allowing the Germans to come in to the rest of Czechoslovakia, he said to his foreign minister, our people will curse us forever, but we have saved their lives. He said, okay, so that blackmail actually worked in 38. The war wasn't on 39. The war wasn't on yet. September 1st, 39, he attacks Poland. What if he delayed that until they had the bomb? There was every reason to believe, and if anybody here, we can talk later, but I'd love to hear a contradiction of this if somebody knows better. But to the best of my knowledge, not as an expert, but as somebody who's read a lot about this, the Germans indeed had the best scientists. They had expelled, a whole slew of Jewish scientists, which was very costly to them. Well, let me take that back. The Jewish scientists didn't win the war in Germany. Hitler didn't suffer from that specifically. The Japanese did, you might say, and the rest. But they still had Heisenberg, the uncertainty principle, no better nuclear physicist in the world to study this. And the basic inhibition they came up with was, we can't do this in less than 4 or 5 years. And Hitler was very impatient, a factor of his character and historical events. And it had to be now. It had to be now. He wanted the war over fast. So he didn't pursue nuclear energy. What if instead they had convinced him that you should delay this for several years till we have the bomb? I think there would be a Nazi Eurasia right now, or at least in Europe. I don't think you would ever have gotten it out.
It's an interesting counterfactual because I think he was worried about. It's an interesting counterfactual because Hitler.
Okay, that's counterfactual. But I was saying, what then followed, since he didn't have it, was that we had the monopoly. We were supposed that we were facing somebody who was holding down East Europe the same way Hitler had held down East Europe, pretty much, okay? Looked very similar there. And the idea that they wanted the West, by the way, there's an analogy very much to something right now. There's a number of analogies right now. Khrushchev did want to get West Berlin under East German control. Absolutely. Why did it matter so much? Well, I was just reading a book about North Korea by a Russian expert on Korea, a professor in Seoul named Lankov, the other day, saying South Korea represents an enormous threat to the North Korean regime simply by existing next door to it, speaking the same language, same background, same relatives and everything, and being enormously freer and richer. So that North Korea has to nail down every type of communication to keep their people from understanding how big the difference is between North Korea and South Korea. And that all the North Koreans know from one way or another that South Koreans have it somewhat better, but they don't know, they have no comparison at all to this. Well, West Berlin was the same way. West Berlin was a rich, subsidized, very subsidized, but rich, free city in the midst of a tyranny. Why a tyranny? Because Germans, who had invaded Russia twice, didn't really want to be run by Russians or by a communist regime, and they had to be sat on hard to keep them from becoming anti-Russian, anti-Soviet. So that West Berlin represented a threat to the stability of the East German regime. So he wanted to get that. Well, I'm going to come back into analogies now, which are rife. But the one here is both Korea and Ukraine and some others, which is this. So long as West Berlin persisted 200 miles inside East Germany without any access, it was a danger, in part because of defection. People were draining the brain drain, they called it, by the tens of thousands into West Berlin and then into West Europe. How do we defend West Berlin? There was one way and one way only to defend West Berlin from being walked into by the Russians, and that was to threaten nuclear war. Well, we did that in '48 with the B-29s. Now, actually, the B-29s we first sent over were not configured for use with atomic bombs. They had to have special bomb bays, special racks. They didn't have those. And we didn't send any nuclear warheads with them, though eventually we did. But that bluff worked. That's when we had a monopoly. Later, then, when Khrushchev raises the threat again of basically blockading or simply walking into West Berlin, the threat under Eisenhower and then under Kennedy, under us, was that threatens World War III. Meaning what? Meaning, and here I was involved in some of the planning, in a kibitzing role primarily. It wasn't my main field. But the idea was, well, we send troops in if they try to blockade. If they stop those troops, we send a bigger brigade, to test it. And if they stop those, armed conflict. And what does that mean? There were 22 Soviet armored divisions within that part of Germany. There was no way in the world we could force our way into Berlin to give them access. And what if they stopped air access this time as well then? So you couldn't hold it by air. We would use tactical nuclear weapons. Okay. But by this time, the Russians had hundreds and hundreds of tactical nuclear weapons and medium-range weapons. They could obliterate Europe. This is before they got ICBMs, even, with which to attack the US. But they could wipe out Europe. What we were threatening was a threat of insane action, a threat of, as arose in Vietnam, destroying the village in order to save it, literally sacrificing Europe in order to keep Berlin from being occupied. Now, that's a threat of an insane action. And it's tempting to say it's an insane policy. And actually, I will say that now. But at the time, you could also say, no, it's a threat of an insane action, of a suicidal, homicidal action, and it can work. And it did work. And nothing else would have worked. So that's where we were then. Now we move up to, however, I would say, to have threatened essentially what we then thought of not as nuclear winter, not of homicide. We didn't know that was in the cards yet, but we did know total annihilation of Eurasia, Europe and Asia. And within a few years, the US as well. Okay, that's the threat. Blow the place up. And it worked. I would say insane, immoral, to prepare that, to rely on that. Well, what's the alternative? The alternative was to find some other way of providing for the security of Europe to the extent it was needed. For example, you could transport every Berliner into West Germany, and you could take every block, you could take every brick of Berlin if you wanted, and move it out on an airlift, or simply rebuild it outside for a fraction of the cost we were spending on the ability to destroy life in the Northern Hemisphere in order to do that. But that was not even raised as a possibility. We just make the threat. Now, move up to what's happening right now. North Korea feels that we intend regime change. They're right. Regime change has been in the minds of the White House, Democrat and Republican, for a generation here. We exercise invasion annually of North Korea with South Korean forces, and we're doing it last month, exercising the invasion of North Korea. We exercise and prepare for, and we deploy special forces units openly described as meant to assassinate Kim Jong-un and, quote, decapitate the regime. But this little fat, little rocket man has this paranoid fantasy that he might be under some threat from the U.S. just because we do stuff like that. What can you do with him? So he feels that he needs a deterrent against this attack, which we are constantly exercising. And he has, for reasons I won't go through all the history, but he acquired now nuclear weapons. But they only have the range to annihilate South Korea and large parts of Japan. Well, you might say, that should be pretty deterrent. It would deter me. Except that we have Lindsey Graham, now the confidant of the president, who has now said repeatedly on television that in course of golfing conversations on weekends at Mar-a-Lago with President Trump, he said, he has said face to face to me, and I agree with him, remember, the casualties will all be over there. Repeat, he said, thousands and thousands will die, but they won't be over there. They won't be over here. Okay? Now, statements like that in the press give Kim Jong-un the feeling that his deterrent isn't fully adequate against this administration, and that he must have the ability to kill Americans as well. I lived through an analogy to this that is exact. Khrushchev found that he was going to lose the one ally that he had in the world, Cuba, that had not become communist through Soviet troops going into it. They had even a sentimental attachment to Cuba, and for that reason, it reminded them of their revolutionary past and their fathers. They loved Che Guevara, but also they would be blamed by China for losing Cuba and not being able to do anything about it. But at that time, if we had gone into Cuba, they could have walked into Berlin. And Kennedy had that very much in his mind. If we invade Cuba, as he was exercising during 1962, the biggest exercises we had done since World War II, against a mythical dictator named Ortsak. Castro spelled backwards, as Khrushchev noticed. And Castro said, I used to play a game like that when I was a kid, yes, backwards spelling of names. So we were exercising invasion of Castro. So Khrushchev, feeling that his evident ability to annihilate Europe was not a sufficient deterrent, decided to put missiles in range of the US by sending them to Cuba. And by the way, no Americans to speak of outside the CIA in the White House and a handful in the Pentagon were aware that we were preparing invasion plans and were attempting to assassinate Castro with the help of the mafia under both Eisenhower and Kennedy, and to some degree under Johnson later. So we didn't know that, but they knew that. So they were responding to that in effect. And we're looking right now at a country, Kim Jong-un, that is faced with what is no longer covert, absolutely open intentions and efforts to overthrow them. Now, how much can you sympathize with North Korea? A tyrannous, murderous regime, a dictatorship, closed, couldn't be worse particularly. Expansionist, a threat to the United States? How so? And is it possible that they could do without ICBMs and H-bombs? People who know the story of North Korea, not me, but I read people, Don Coughlin said, yes, they are open to negotiating no longer missile tests or warhead tests. At least there's every reason, and the Chinese and Russian proposed just that could do it. They then would not have a threat to the US directly. They can, by the way, just put a warhead on a boat and send it over here very easily, and they've always been able to do that. So when Lindsey Graham says the casualties will all be over there, he's not quite right. We would go, Los Angeles would go, Long Beach Harbor would go probably from a boat, not in 30 days, not in 30 minutes, but in 30 days. But as of now, they're trying to get ICBMs. The idea of getting them to give up ICBMs and H-bombs is said by everyone who knows anything about Korea to be very possible and worth doing. To get them to give up their existing fission atom bombs, which they regard as the only deterrent to the death of Kim Jong-un and his regime, is not feasible. And Trump is saying that as a condition of negotiations right now, which is not possible. Kim thinks he would be crazy to give up those weapons. And that's not the kind of crazy he is. The kind he is crazy, it seems, is that he thinks that if it comes to war, the important thing is to get in the first blow, give the other side a severe bloody nose, and cause them to back off. That's the only way you can do it. He can't win in the end over, he can't defeat the United States, but he could cause them by hitting their local bases and whatnot to say, oh, this is costing too much, let's make terms. That's crazy. And it's the nature of NATO planning for 40 years. Pretty much the same plans we had. And today's news is, in the Wall Street Journal and elsewhere, behind a paywall, but somebody gave me a copy, that our plans that we're now considering under H.R. McMaster, the Special Security Advisor, is, quote, to give the North Koreans a bloody nose, to show them that we are determined. We really do want them to give up their nuclear weapons, and to show it, we hit their missile sites, we hit command and control, we do something else. The chance of that actually ending hostilities is as close to zero as anything could be. Nothing is quite zero, come to that, but that's very close to zero. That's not going to happen. Both sides, in other words, are under the crazy impression that it's better for them to go first than second. And if they're convinced that war is coming, or in Trump's case, that it's the only way of getting rid of their nuclear weapons, he might do it. And actually, he's not wrong about this. There is no other way, no other military solution. Let me quote one of my favorite authorities, Stephen Bannon, who has been saying throughout, before he was fired, there is no military solution in Korea, one of the reasons he was fired. Well, when he's right, he's right. It's possible to be both crazy and smart in the same head, and in fact, it happens all the time.
And
so Trump, on the other hand, if he really believes that he can, or H.R. McMaster, he can give the North Koreans a bloody nose and it will stop there, it's crazy. And okay, the theme of my book was expressed in an earlier form of the title, A Chronicle of Madness, that the nuclear epoch has been one in which very widely leaderships in both sides have believed, have held crazy beliefs as to what was possible, what was necessary, and what was justified. And they've been allowed to do that to a large extent. Just as Republicans, let's say, will go along now with the idea that there is no man-made climate change. And say, Patricia and I were flying up here tonight and looking out, and I was thinking, thank God this isn't New York we're flying into right now. So they're able to live through what's happening in New York right now and in Boston and say, no climate change. Well, likewise, our military planning for nuclear war has been based on the idea, sort of, well, if we have to carry this out, here's how we'll do it. You know, and it's different ways of planning near extinction of the human species.
And on that happy note, I think it's time for some questions.
Yep. So my name is Edward. I'm from the Town Hall staff. I invite you to come line up. We have a brief amount of time for questions. Before we get to them, 2 quick logistical announcements. After Q&A, there will be a book signing. If you would like to get your book signed, purchase it from the University Bookstore table in the lobby and line up against the west wall here. Mr. Ellsberg will be signing in front of the stage. One other announcement, the Washington Physicians for Social Responsibility will be convening a follow-up conversation about tonight's event here in the church on Wednesday, January 24th. If you don't get your question answered or come away from tonight with many more questions and want community around that, you can pick up information on the WPSR table in the lobby. But for now, we have time for a few questions. So, sir, your first question.
It was that 1983 was was perhaps the most dangerous part, comparable to the Cuban Missile Crisis 20 years earlier. And we didn't even know that. And the reason was that the then Soviet leader, former KGB head, Andropov, had become convinced that the US, Reagan, was planning a first strike against the Soviet Union. Now, Reagan was not. That was absolutely wrong. But what could have given that clue, that idea? How could Reagan himself was astonished when he was finally convinced by a defector that Andropov really had feared that, and that his actions in part were in response to that fear. How could he have imagined that? Well, Reagan was conducting the largest, fastest buildup of nuclear arms since John F. Kennedy. We're now involved in the third such buildup now. But Reagan's was the $1 trillion buildup like that. Second, Reagan, to put the Soviets off guard, was doing exercises off the Soviet coast and sending reconnaissance planes even into Soviet airspace, testing their defenses as if preparing for an invasion. This was very secret. Almost nobody in the government knew that he was doing that. When they saw Russian reactions, such as the shoot down of KAL 007, the Korean airliner, hardly anybody realized that that followed actions of penetration that had been happening and that they confused that with a military reconnaissance plane at that time. Third, we had a president who regarded the Soviet Union as an evil empire, as he said openly, and one that should be eliminated, essentially. He even joked at a microphone on one occasion, which he didn't realize was an open microphone. And he was just testing beforehand. And he said, the Soviet Union has been banned, the bombing will begin in 15 minutes. And so forth, showing a sort of same mind. And fourth, Reagan was batting down the idea of a nuclear weapons freeze, of the kind of freeze word that's come out recently in connection with North Korea, stopping exercises on our part, stopping testing on their part. Well, the idea of a bilateral nuclear weapons freeze, with no more nuclear weapons, which I was a big part of, had to be batted down by Reagan very, very hard. He was putting first strike weapons like Pershing II into East Germany with an ability to hit Moscow within minutes. And finally, this just came out within the last year, after, almost 30 years later, that they had gotten from a defector, from a spy, a very super secret, higher than top secret plan in NATO for the decapitation of Soviet command and control, which, did you know this, or have you followed this? Which scared the hell out of them. As I say, this only became available in the last year, that they had this plan for cyber warfare, basically, and for hitting various command and control points, which looked exactly like a first strike plan that we might think might work. So here we had gotten Andropov into thinking that we were preparing to use an exercise, which was a nuclear weapons exercise in Europe called Able Archer, would be the cover for an actual surprise attack. And he had a huge intelligence thing going on. Up to this point, it's exactly like the present, both with respect to Russia and North Korea. And B, one little factor in here, Andropov, the KGB former chairman, and now the prime minister, the president, believed that Reagan was crazy. And he wasn't the only one who thought that, actually, to remind people at the time. And just a little footnote right now, it's in the news this week, more, that Reagan was showing evidence of Alzheimer's in the White House, and which of course later became very evident. But he regarded him as crazy. We have an open discussion going right now of whether we have a crazy president or not, or whether he's only pretending to be crazy. and whether that makes a difference, all of that. All of it leading up to the notion that they fear that this person might actually launch a surprise attack, okay? All that is similar. And now, what no one who's commented on this crisis, I take it you've studied it, the able archer and so forth, nobody comments on the fact that Andropov's readiness to respond to that was to preempt the attack, to move first. Go second first. Don't wait for the first one to go. Don't do like Barbarossa in World War II, where Hitler's armies captured millions and millions of Russians with a surprise attack. No, go first in a nuclear era. But that's insane. That's insane. Go first. The world ends when you go first. When, as of when? When did we learn that? 1983. That's the year of able archer. In that year, Carl Sagan and the others came out with the news for the first time that the smoke from burning cities would be lofted into the stratosphere by firestorms. And here we were asking whether history repeats itself. In World War II, we were only able to get firestorms going 3 times mainly, though there were 2 other rather very small firestorms at Hamburg, Dresden, and Tokyo. And a firestorm is a very special kind of a fire. You have to have simultaneous fires over a widespread area, which create updrafts from low pressure zones. Then in the heated air rises and bring in winds either in a rolling conflagration across, if there's a ground wind, or from all sides, creating temperatures now that are enormously high, 1,500 degrees Fahrenheit, 1,200 degrees in some cases, 1,500 in others. Temperatures you don't get under any other conditions except a nuclear weapon. Hiroshima created a firestorm, but nothing between Tokyo on March 9th and 10th and Hiroshima on August 6th created a firestorm. That's why they only killed 900,000 people, of whom 100,000 were on one night, because that was the firestorm. It lofts. Now what they discovered was, in 1983, the smoke from the burning city will be lofted by the firestorm, the force of these updrafts, into the stratosphere where it doesn't rain out. And it goes around the globe very quickly, obstructing sunlight for what we now know is more than a decade. Perhaps 70% of sunlight would be obstructed. This is assuming many cities, hundreds of cities being hit simultaneously, which would happen in our plans or Russian plans. Okay, the harvests would all be destroyed. They would be aborted, they would be ended. There would be no harvest, very little vegetation left, and nearly everyone would starve on Earth. Nuclear winter, not only a matter of the lakes freezing and the rivers freezing and terrible cold and drought, whatnot, but the death of the harvest would mean that the world food supplies of about 60 days would be over. It would take longer than 60 days for the US because a lot of it is concentrated here. So we wouldn't export it anymore. So the people who rely on exports of US food or Chinese soybeans, whatnot, they starve first. We starve later, within a year. Now, that is that's what's being threatened now by any initiation of nuclear war. That was discovered in '83, but Russian scientists, Stenchikov and some of the others, had discovered it a little before ours did, 82, 81. Gorbachev referred to this. So Andropov's plan of preempting the attack, was he crazy? No one ever said Andropov was crazy, but this was a crazy plan. It was exactly like ours all this time. And the idea of preempting. Right now in North Korea, nuclear winter is not at stake. Of 9 nuclear states, only 1 cannot blot out enough sunlight to starve at least 2 billion people. The Indians and Pakistanis can do that. The others can do more. North Korea, whether it has 20 or 30 or 60 weapons, can't cause nuclear winter. And they don't have enough cities there for us to let off that much smoke. But what would be involved is the death of several million people, more in one day or a week than has ever been seen in the history of the world. See, the biggest, number one, is Tokyo, 100,000, 80 to 120,000. This would be several million within a day or a week. So bigger than ever, but not nuclear winter. Andropov, however, but not a good idea for North Korea. If North Korea thinks it's a good idea to start a war with the United States, wrong. That would be wrong. On the other hand, if he has made provision to assure nuclear response to his being killed, Kim Jong-un, that's like every other ruler pretty much on this. You know, Hitler was willing to see Germany burned to the ground if he was going to get killed. I would say that ideas of decapitating Kim Jong-un are as reckless and murderous and, as they could be. But come back to Andropov. Andropov was not Donald J. Trump. And yet, his plans were to preempt. And here's what I put to you, Daniel. I haven't seen anyone comment on that. No one has said, and by the way, this plan, because it's so familiar, it's a SAC plan, a Strategic Air Command. That's what we would do, with the same effect. Exactly. So we are building now another $1 trillion, perhaps $1.6 trillion, in allowing for inflation in the next 30 years, for weapons to do exactly this, to preempt an attack with this effect, right? So I'm saying that it's a craziness altogether. And in answer to your question, does history repeat itself? It hardly changes. It just goes on. Okay.
So I want to say we are running very low on time, and there's many people who want to ask questions. So I'm sorry we will not be able to get to many more questions, but we can do one last question here. I'm sorry.
Yeah. All right. So. Dan, I have a one-sentence question about the increasing automation of military operations and warfare. By the way, Peter Lumsdaine from the Ground Zero Jeep action in Nevada back in the 80s on the Vandenberg MX campaign. So my question is, how do you think that the rapidly accelerating rise of corporate military robotics and artificial intelligence affects the challenges and resistance strategies for the human race in this century?
How do you think the corporate rise of AI, artificial intelligence, affects basically deterrence and nuclear planning going forward?
There is talk now of automating drone warfare almost entirely, under automatic intelligence. Under Obama, the rules of engagement were raised for the drones at one point, and I think it was under Petraeus in particular in Afghanistan, to allow drones to attack anyone who fitted certain profiles of movement or of communications and various things. They didn't have to be any intelligence specifying them. They didn't have to be carrying special weapons or uniforms or anything else. But if they acted in a certain way, if they communicated in a certain way, Hellfire missiles come down and hit wedding party after wedding party after wedding party and funeral parties. And then when people come out to the funerals of the people who've been kidding before, they get hit too, because they're a convocation of vehicles in the desert. What are they doing all together like that anyway? So this is horrible, but that's what happens. Well, you can automate that pretty easily. If you have a set of criteria for launching the criterion, that's all it takes. In fact, at one point they said any male between, 14 and 40, something like that, is to be what? Enemy combatants. Well, a computer can figure that one out. Facial recognition isn't too great, but it's good enough for that, basically. So you can automate that. In the book, I quote, going back now into the 50s, General Cooter, who had various jobs, but at one point he was head of North American Air Defense Command, at other times Pacific Air Command, was saying to Herb York, who was then the director of research and engineering. I think at that time he was still director of Livermore Lab. Later under Kennedy was research and engineering. So he tells that they were just starting on ABM work then, and he said, anti-ballistic missile, and he said, the timing is so fast there, the missiles are coming over, you can't wait for human decision. You've got to automate this link and so forth. And Herbert York was sort of going along with this up to a point. And then he said, of course, eventually we get it to the point where it's entirely computerized. And York says, they'll recognize it, they'll go against it. And remember, one of the things always in their mind on use of nuclear weapons was, in the air, there's no problem. That's not quite true if you happen to be underneath where the explosions are happening. But in general, it's up in the air, it's in space. You can relatively delegate it, And actually, North American Air Defense Command was the first to be delegated the authority to use nuclear weapons without the president doing it in the mid-50s. Okay, so Cooter says, but eventually we'll get it so it's totally automated. And York says, oh no, we're never going to do that. And he reports, Cooter looked at him and said, well, we might as well surrender right now then. And so the answer then on AI and artificial intelligence, I believe, is there are many people who do not shrink from the idea of a Terminator-type warfare, world in which the computers are waging war with us underneath, essentially, it happening, or in the midst. Yes, this does have to change. Since I've mentioned York, I want to mention one other thing. York, who I came to know late in his life, had once gone back to Livermore Lab, the second nuclear design lab. There are two major nuclear design labs, both of them campuses of the University of California. All of our nuclear weapons, from the atom bomb, first ones, Fat Man, Little Man, to the neutron bomb, to everything else, have all been designed at an American university. One university, the University of California. Now, the relationship has changed a little bit, in part because in administrative problems they were having about security and whatnot. But anyway, York went back to Livermore and said, I've asked myself how many weapons it takes to deter someone rational enough to be deterred. How many does it take? So, what would you say? Any candidates here?
I'm hearing one.
One? Well, that's what York said. One. He said one, but maybe you'd say you needed a few more, in case they thought they could get the one, or one city they might be willing to sacrifice, something like that. Maybe 10. And then he went at it from another point of view. He said, what's the largest amount of destruction you would want one man, one person, one woman to be able to inflict in a brief period of time? Is there some ceiling on that, or is there a too much? And he said, how about the total casualties of World War II? 60 million. Maybe the ability to kill 60 million people in a week or so should be the limit for what somebody can control. He says, well, that would take about 100 weapons, 100 kiloton weapons. He said, you could calculate, it might get up to 200, but probably not. It would be 100 or less. So he said the number needed to deter nuclear attack, which, by the way, Judith, is where I started. How do we deter this attack? The number needed would be, quote, 1 to 10 to 100, but closer to 1 than 100. He says, okay. That would mean, by the way, 49. If North Korea has 60, which they probably don't, it's probably less, that's more than you could justify on this ground. Every other nuclear weapon state has many more than that. When Eisenhower came into office in 1953, we had 1,000 fission weapons, the type that destroyed Nagasaki, only most of them more powerful by that time than Nagasaki. But fission weapons, 1,000 that Truman left. When Eisenhower left office, we had 23,000, mostly thermonuclear weapons. The earlier thermonuclear weapons used Nagasaki weapons, need Nagasaki weapons as their detonator, as their percussion cap, as their fuse, you might say. The earliest of our H-bombs, it's easier to make a big one than a small one, actually, were 1,000 times more powerful than the Nagasaki. So we had 23,000 of those. Eventually, in 1967, under Johnson, see, I was in Vietnam in 67. In 67, we had 37,000 nuclear weapons. The Russians had close to 40,000 at that point too. At the height, there was a total in the world of about 67,000 nuclear weapons. Come back to Herb York's point. 1 to 10 to 100 and closer to 1 than 100. Is it desirable to keep North Korea from getting an H-bomb and an ICBM? Yes. It was also desirable that Pakistan not get them, and that Egypt and that India not get them, et cetera, et cetera. In fact, all of the others, in effect. Would that be the end of the world? Or is there any reason to believe, by the way, that North Korea would use those weapons against the U.S. out of the blue, unprovoked? Actually, no reason. Is it impossible? No, I wouldn't say it was impossible. He could have a false alarm. He could go crazy, something like that. It's definitely desirable he not have them. Are there ways of keeping him from getting them other than attacking? Probably yes, according to the people who know North Korea best. You'd have to have a peace treaty with North Korea we don't have one since the Korean War. You'd have to lower or drop the sanctions. You'd have to stop exercising assassination and invasion. Those things, that doesn't seem impossible demands somehow. Well, that means we give up regime change. How can you give up regime change just because they're another country and aren't, not a state of the United States? Well, since Iraq, we've talked about regime change, which is the definition of empire. A country that believes that it has the right and the power and the readiness and the intention to determine who rules another country. And we are, in fact, a covert empire, in my opinion. Covert in the sense of plausible denial, meaning the fact that we are an empire, that we have this determination to decide who runs this country and that country, is covert. We deny it plausibly. Why plausibly? Well, our people are educated to think, well, that's not us. That's not who we are. Actually, it is who we are, but we deny that. It's, well, he said, and moreover, the means are covert: assassination, bribery, paramilitary, coups, and whatnot. So it's a denied empire, pretty much. If we gave that up, we would have a good chance of keeping North Korea from not moving ahead with ICBMs. That would be good. The military alternative is the almost certain death of several million people, mostly over there, our allies, mostly South Korea and Japan. And actually...
So we are running very, very long, but, and I said that would be the last question, but folks in the line rightly pointed out one final question, Daniel Ellsberg. If you could very briefly before we go, give this audience advice on what they can do as citizens to respond to the information you have presented to us tonight.
We can't live with this regime with Trump.
Yes. Okay. I would say the current situation calls for the highest degree of one can imagine. I can't imagine what would be too much non-violently and truthfully to do, to convey to Congress, but above all to the executive branch, there must not be an attack on North Korea. That should be heard in letters to the editor, be heard in town hall meetings like this. Thank you for raising the question. I apologize for not raising it earlier, and I think Judith and David are going to raise this more about the discussion of what to do. But I would put at the highest priority avoiding a war with North Korea. And keep in touch with that in a way you couldn't do years ago. But now it's possible on the internet to find out a tremendous amount is leaking out, to be sure, to the rage of Trump. I can certainly say, by the way, that if someone in the administration, there must be hundreds of people, thousands of people, who have access to estimates in the administration that officially tell that not all the casualties would be over there, and that the casualties over there are absolutely intolerable. That's not the word that would be used officially. They would just say millions, and would say, and by the way, it's not only, the effects of this war would not only be measured in casualties, in my opinion. And let me take 1 minute on that, because I believe we are in a crisis right now, not unlike the Cuban Missile Crisis or the '83 crisis, except in scale. We're not looking at the end of the world. By the way, when I say that San Francisco may go as a result of this, it's not the end of the world, but you know, it's what it is. It's horrible. But beyond the casualties, if there is an attack on this country in retaliation, which I would think is not certain, but highly likely, democracy is pretty much over in this country, I think. This country becomes one large airport terminal security area, total surveillance, ID cards, going through metal detectors everywhere you turn around. Martial law, to a large extent. I'm talking about assuming that there is an attack, let's say, on a city from a weapon in a container freight from North Korea as a result of this. Otherwise, in the world, I think non-proliferation is over, proliferation is on, essentially, once it becomes clear that nuclear weapons are used and usable on both sides, despite the horrible effects. Say, well, the effects are horrible, but better to have them than not have them. So Japan and others, South Korea, South Korea is pretty much gone, actually, at this point. India and Pakistan get H-bombs instead of A-bombs. Testing resumes with almost certainty. I have not seen this in print anywhere said. Have you seen anybody say that? Well, I'll just put it to you from my experience. After that war, in which is testing, they'll be looking at all the measurements, the first two-sided nuclear war ever. We're right now making the first threats against a nuclear weapons state that have ever been made since the Cuban Missile Crisis 55 years ago. So I think testing resumes. India and Pakistan move from having fission bombs, Nagasaki-type bombs, to H-bombs. And the difference that makes is that if they have a war, and they've come close to it several times in the last 20 years, over Kashmir, now they would starve, because of the effect on sunlight, 1 to 2 billion people. 1/3 of the Earth's population. With H-bombs, they're nuclear winter control. 7 billion, they can do everything. That's not a good change. The idea of moving away from our current hair-triggered doomsday machines, I think, is essentially over, for not just for my lifetime, which isn't that long, but for as long as you can see, for a long time. It'll have to be a very different world generations from now to move away from the doomsday machines after the war, which is being told we are considering it, we are preparing it, we're ready to do it, and this and that, daily, like today. So there should be committees of correspondence, there should be town hall meetings. As there were, for instance, there were meetings with legislators when they come back, Republican and Democrat, as there were when the issue arose of war with Syria, over the gas attack in Syria. And it was the American public, not really particularly triggered by activists, as far as I'm aware, that told their legislators, what was this, 2013, we don't want another Middle Eastern war now. And there is a case, by the way, where Syria is a horrible situation, Assad, a murderous tyrant, and where I think that U.S. intervention could only have made matters worse, even worse than they actually were. So we managed to get out of that with the help of Putin, actually, and Barack Obama. The ultimate thing, though, going beyond this crisis, which is right now, this month, next month, is, I would say, a necessary element is we need a new Congress. There has to be a Democratic House and or Senate, and it has to be different Democrats from the ones we've seen for the last 10 years. That hardly gets us anywhere. But with Democrats who are different from the ones we've seen in this, I think then the possibility for investigation, for raising all the issues that I raised, for allowing the public to be heard on this, it becomes possible. And it's not only bad things that happen as surprises. I've lived long enough to have seen several secular miracles. And one of them is the downfall of the Berlin Wall, the ending of the Warsaw Pact that we were talking about earlier, followed, not necessarily, but followed by the U.S. incorporating that and moving first use threats right up to the border of Russia and Poland. Okay, then there was Nelson Mandela, came to power. No one foresaw that. So no one can say it's impossible to change this. Is it likely that the military-industrial people who make money out of keeping these doomsday machines on alert on both sides? Russia now has a profit motive when they build this stuff, in addition to the bureaucratic motives, just as we do. There is essentially no other motive for keeping our intercontinental ballistic missiles, which are nothing but lightning rods for attack, essentially. So to reproduce those is reproducing a doomsday machine without any justifiable rationale. That can be, it's not impossible. It will be very difficult to change that, but it's not impossible, and that's what we must do.
Daniel Ellsberg, Professor Daniel Bessner, thank you so much for being here. I'm sorry that went so long, but this is a very powerful and important conversation.